I guess I never really lived until I was 64. I thought to myself, David, what has he kept me from all these years? What have I deprived myself of? This questioning inside me felt like both a rebuke and an awakening. Bruce didn't say anything, he just watched, and that gave me courage. He supported me, not with his hands, but with his eyes, as my fingers slowly grasped the straps and pulled them down. Oh, hello there. I didn't see you there. I was just telling a little story about what we have been through. Let me start again so you can get the full picture of how it all unfolded. I was 64 years old, and to be honest, I never thought that something as innocent as tidying up would lead to this, all thanks to the sudden appearance of my step-grandson. It had been 12 years since my husband David had died, and I had felt lonely and widowed for far too long. It was late in the morning when I finally decided to tackle the one thing I'd been putting off for years, cleaning out the basement. That chaotic little corner of the house that I avoided every time it crossed my mind, the thought of it making my chest tighten. But I'd worked up the courage to face it. That dusty room full of old boxes, musty-smelling junk, and memories of a lifetime. The first box I opened revealed something that took me completely by surprise, an old photo album from my younger days. As I flicked through it, one photograph in particular stood out. It was from a beach party. There I was, margarita in hand, wearing a bright orange bikini, laughing like I didn't care. A carefree young Elizabeth, beaming with joy, was staring back at me. Looking at this photo stirred something in me. It was a mixture of warmth and sadness, memories I'd buried long ago, desires and excitement I'd suppressed. It all came rushing back. And just then, I heard a noise coming from the basement door. Startled, I turned to see Bruce, my step-grandson, standing there. I hadn't seen him for 4 years. He looked bigger now, more grown up, with that familiar smile of his. The last time I saw him, he was 23. Now he must have been 27. Surprise, he said, lifting a coffee cup into the air. Bruce, when did you get here? I asked, surprised but genuinely happy to see him. Just now, he replied, making his way down the stairs. Saw your car outside and thought I'd come in. Looks like you could use a hand. I was about to say, no, I'll do it. But before I could, he'd walked over, a determined look on his face. For someone so young, his eyes landed on the album I was holding in my hand. What's this? He asked. Before I could snatch the photo from his hand, I froze for a moment. His eyes were fixed on the picture of young Elizabeth on the beach. He stared at it for what seemed like an eternity before turning to me. Is this you? Well, yes, I said with a nervous laugh. My wild years back then. Bruce's gaze shifted from the photo back to me. There was something in his eyes, a mixture of admiration and surprise. It was both unsettling and, oddly, somehow warming. Wow, it's weird to think of you like that, but impressive, he said, smiling. If you like these little confessions, join me on my channel for more. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because trust me, this story is just getting started and you won't want to miss it. I felt something flicker inside me, something I couldn't quite understand. Feelings I had buried for years, emotions David had never really awakened in me. They surfaced for a moment. But this wasn't right. It couldn't be. All right, enough with the trip down memory lane, I said, quickly closing the album. We've got to get these old boxes out of here. But I had no idea where this photo, Bruce's expressions, and the storm brewing inside me were going to take me. Bruce gently stopped my hands as I tried to close the album. We really need to look at this, he said, half joking, half serious. It's incredible to see you so young, alive and different. Come on, let's have a look. I hesitated for a moment. Not all the pictures in the album were innocent. Beyond those carefree beach snaps, there were bolder photos, moments that captured the wilder side of my youth. But seeing Bruce's fascination and the admiration in his eyes, I couldn't say no. All right, I said with a small smile, but some of these photos might be a bit much. Bruce chuckled and nodded. I'm sure everything's fine, he said, taking the album in his lap as he sat down next to me. His breath was close enough to brush my skin as we flipped through the pages. The beach party photos gave way to snapshots from my college years in nightclubs. One photo showed me in a tight, backless red dress, dancing tipsy. Bruce lingered on it, staring a little too long. Is this really you? He asked, his eyes darting between the photo and me, his face lighting up with a mixture of awe and curiosity. Yes, I replied, a little shyly. It was just youth, you know. Things were different then. Bruce was silent for a moment before finally saying, You're amazing. He paused and then added, All this time, I've just thought of you as my grandma, but you've been like a total, I don't know, party girl. His words made me blush, but at the same time they stirred something in me. I thought about how David had never shown me this kind of admiration, even when I was younger. He'd always been distant, cold, and stern. But Bruce? He was different. The look in his eyes told me more than his words ever could. As we flipped through the album, the photos became bolder. There was one of me laughing with friends, wearing short shorts and a bikini top. Another showed me dancing in a nightclub in a plunging black dress. Bruce smiled softly and said, It's a privilege to see these. Even when you were younger, your beauty was stunning. David was a lucky man. His words warmed me, but they also made me feel something else, something strange. The more I felt Bruce's attention, his interest, the more I realized there was an attraction between us. He was like the kind of man I'd dreamed of when I was younger, confident, openly admiring, and eager to discover the parts of me I'd kept hidden. When we reached the last page, Bruce closed the album, but didn't take his eyes off me. Elizabeth, he said in a low voice, you are truly extraordinary. I was surprised and touched by his words. It had been so long since anyone had looked at me like that, or told me things like that. As my eyes locked with Bruce's, I felt the air between us grow heavier. Something was shifting. Despite the cold, dusty atmosphere of the cellar, a warmth rose within me. Bruce's presence made me feel young again. At the same time, I had no idea where these feelings were taking me. When Bruce closed the album and turned to me, there was still that deep admiration in his eyes. Elizabeth, he said, his voice low but completely sincere. After seeing all these pictures, I have to say this. You haven't aged a day. You still look young and absolutely beautiful. The compliment took my breath away for a moment. Even in my youth, I wasn't used to hearing words like that, especially from David. My heart beat a little faster, and I felt a slight warmth creep into my cheeks. Thank you, Bruce, I said, but there's no hiding the fact that I've aged. Still, I paused for a moment, gathering my courage before continuing. I may have grown older, but I haven't lost touch with my desires. I've never let them go. Bruce smiled, his green eyes fixed on mine, unwavering. I can feel that, he said. You're not just beautiful, you're absolutely captivating. I couldn't help but let my eyes wander for a moment over his broad, athletic frame. His tall stature, broad shoulders, and slightly curly blonde hair gave him the look of a movie star. But what struck me most was the confident yet gentle expression in his green eyes. It's interesting to hear that from someone like you, I said with a faint smile. I added, David was nothing like you. He was always so quiet, so distant. He never did anything to really surprise or excite me. He was a good man, but... Bruce tilted his head, listening intently, but not interrupting. But not the kind of man you wanted, was he? He asked. I thought about looking away, but couldn't. Yes, I said honestly. David was never as exciting or passionate as I wanted him to be. I'm not saying he was a bad man, but I always felt there was something missing. Bruce was silent for a moment, before giving me a gentle yet confident smile. Maybe it's important that you realize that, he said. Maybe now is the time to find out what fills that void. His words lit a spark in me. The way this young man showed interest in me, understood me, and spoke with such confidence, it stirred an excitement I hadn't felt in years. It was then that I realized that Bruce wasn't just different from David. He was also incredibly close to the kind of man I had dreamed about in my youth. But I didn't know where these feelings would take me, or if they were even the right direction. After a pause, Bruce stood up and put his hands in his pockets. His green eyes rested on me again. "I'll put the bike in the garage and be right back," he said in a calm voice. "But don't stay in the cellar, Elizabeth. Wait for me in the living room, okay?" The confidence in his tone and the way he took charge had an unusual effect on me. I nodded slightly, agreeing. "All right, Bruce," I said. Bruce walked upstairs with quick steps, and as I watched him go, I found myself thinking about how even his love for his motorcycle affected me. I imagined what he would look like working on it or riding it, energetic, passionate, determined, exactly the kind of man I used to dream about when I was younger. "He's so much like the person I always imagined him to be," I murmured to myself. "But he's my step-grandson, and yet, right now, he really has an effect on me." I went into the living room and waited. It wasn't long before Bruce returned, holding a bottle of wine. As soon as my eyes landed on the label, I recognized it. It was my favorite rosé. I had no idea how he knew or why he thought of it, but once again, I felt a spark ignite within me. "I got this from the best place I could find," he said with a slight smile. "I hope you like it." "Like it?" I said, surprised. "Bruce, this is my favorite wine. How did you know that?" He shrugged, a look on his face that suggested he didn't really want to explain. "I noticed little things when I was younger, I guess," he said. "I remember correctly." I paused for a moment. The fact that this young man remembered so much about me was deeply touching. "Bruce," I said quietly, "this wine is really special and so thoughtful. Thank you." He opened the bottle, poured it into 2 glasses, and handed one to me. "Then let's share some good memories tonight, Elizabeth," he said. I raised my glass and we toasted. As I took my first sip, the unique taste of the rosé danced on my tongue, and I couldn't help but keep my eyes on Bruce. As the conversation flowed, I found myself drawn to him, not just for his looks, but for the way he thought and carried himself. At one point, when our glasses were almost empty, Bruce's eyes met mine again. There was a warmth in his gaze, a pull that I couldn't ignore. I felt something shifting inside me, a mixture of fear and excitement, but I still had no idea where these feelings were taking me. Suddenly, Bruce stopped. He put his glass down on the table and turned his eyes back to me. This time, his look was more determined, more intense. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice low but filled with emotion he couldn't hide. I looked at him and realized that my breathing had quickened. My heart was pounding in my chest. "Yes, Bruce," I whispered, my voice barely audible, as if it couldn't go any higher. At that moment, Bruce reached for my hand. The warmth of his fingers, running gently over my delicate, slender hand, sent a rush of emotions through me. "I know I shouldn't say this," he began, "but when I look at you, I can't stop myself. You're not only incredibly beautiful, you're so much more than I ever imagined." His words echoed somewhere deep inside me, and I felt my face flush. "Bruce, you—" I started, but before I could finish, he hesitated for a moment before leaning in. At that moment, my heart felt like it was going to stop. As I watched him come closer, I knew I should say no, but I couldn't fight the strong pull I felt towards him. When his lips touched mine, slowly and deliberately, the world seemed to stop for a moment. That kiss, it was soft, but also deep. I felt desires I'd suppressed for years suddenly flood back. As his strong hands moved to my waist, I gave myself over to the moment. When Bruce's lips pulled away from mine, I could feel the tension between us lingering in the air. My heart was still pounding like crazy. I looked at him, hoping that my eyes could somehow express what I was feeling, but putting those feelings into words seemed impossible. At that moment, driven by an impulse I couldn't ignore, I leaned forward and kissed him again. This time, it was me who made the first move. As my lips pressed against his once more, something inside me felt alive again. Bruce seemed a little surprised at first, but he quickly responded. Our kiss grew deeper, more passionate. His hand slid to my waist, his strong fingers pulling me closer, with a gentle yet firm touch. I could feel his warmth radiating through my entire body. As we lay side by side on the couch, there was hardly any space between us. His presence, his breath, everything about him filled the moment completely. Resting against Bruce's chest, a restless feeling began to stir inside me. My heart was still racing, but this time it wasn't fear or hesitation. It was a burning desire to let go completely. I slowly sat up, feeling his curious but calm gaze. His eyes, so focused and intense, seemed to understand everything that was happening inside me without needing a single word. As I stood up, I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding as I let a bold, powerful urge take over. My hands moved to the thin straps of my dress, which had begun to feel like chains holding me back. Bruce didn't say a word. He just watched me, and somehow that gave me courage. He supported me, not with his hands, but with his eyes. As my fingers grasped the straps and slowly pulled them down, the dress slipped off my shoulders and fell gently to the floor. The fabric gathered around my bare feet like a soft puddle. At that moment, I could finally breathe. It wasn't just a physical act. It felt symbolic, like years of bondage had been shed and I was finally free. When I looked back at Bruce, the admiration and awe in his expression was unmistakable. He didn't have to say anything. He understood. This was me breaking through my own boundaries, accepting myself fully. Bruce slowly got up from where he was sitting and held out his hand to me. His touch was, as always, both tender and strong. But this time, I wasn't just hugging him, I was hugging myself. For a full 15 minutes, I stayed in that exact position on the couch, barely moving. I was so close to passing out, but somehow I managed to hold on. Perhaps it was the years of longing that had built up this strange resilience in me. Bruce's broad, powerful frame had always attracted me, but now the intensity of my attraction was on a completely different level. I was breathless, as if I had just left the whole world behind. My heart was racing, my body trembling, and every inch of me felt the impact of his presence. For the first time in my life, I felt physically exhausted in the most exhilarating way. It wasn't a limitation, it was a release. Even as I was lost in these overwhelming emotions, my mind wandered to a strange reflection. I haven't really lived until now, I thought to myself. David, what has he kept me from all these years? What have I been denying myself for so long? This inner questioning felt like both a quiet rebellion and a long overdue awakening. Bruce, still catching his breath, ran a hand through his hair. To see that he was just as affected as I was somehow comforting. He smiled faintly, fixing his disheveled hair, and said in a low voice, I'm going to take a shower. At that moment, I felt the sparkle in his eyes, the softness in his voice, and the quiet determination behind it all. And just like that, everything became even more real. I watched Bruce walk away, but my mind stayed with what had just happened, and the bittersweet joy of discovering myself so late in life. If you've made it this far, I know my story has touched you. There's so much more to share, and you won't want to miss any of it. Make sure you hit the follow button, turn on notifications, and leave a comment on this story. I can't wait to hear what you think. So let's have a chat in the comments. Your support means the world to me.